Hello to everybody. I'm very happy to see you all again. We start with a lecture with Martyn Rawson today. And I think today there's a very, very special guest and a very special topic we have. And I'm quite happy about it because the topic of the lectures, all the lectures is Waldorf work in progress. And when we designed that series of lecture, the question has been, what are the challenges? What are the tasks of Waldorf education right now? And there has been a tremendous development during the last 100 years. And especially there has been international development. So it starts as a maybe German movement, then a European movement, and then it spread all over the world. And right now, of course, there are more Waldorf schools all over the world than in Europe. So it hasn't this European touch anymore. It has developed so far. But the question is, did we take this into account when we're looking into how is Waldorf in the world? Is it still a European product? Is it an international product? And I think Martyn Rawson, he's the best expert we can get on that topic. He's a very experienced Waldorf teacher from the UK, has been a class teacher. Then he attended also the high school teacher training at Stuttgart. And as he just said, he lived a long time in Stuttgart. Now he is affiliated with the Waldorf Teacher Training Center in Kiel, also actively a Waldorf teacher at Hamburg, at a Waldorf school in Hamburg. He is an honorary professor at Taiwan University. And what I really admire, he is doing a huge amount of wonderful research work. So there are many articles of him, and Laura will put it into the chat. You see the ResearchGate entries about Martyn. So he covers so many topics. I can't imagine how you can do this, teaching, doing teacher training, doing schoolwork, and publish so many articles and books. There's a special book, Routledge, about a critical introduction to Waldorf education. So he's really a scholar in the field of Waldorf education. And I'm very, very happy to have you here. And it's wonderful to have that topic, what you have, contextualizing and decolonizing Waldorf education. And yes, please start, Martyn.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Quite a lot to live up to, of course. Just before we came on air, as it were, I had a telephone call from the Netherlands, and I couldn't work out who it was. And it was Christoph Wiekert calling me up to apologize for not being able to come. He had to go and collect someone from the airport that he hadn't planned on. So I suddenly felt this kind of, I don't know, speaking to Christoph, I suddenly felt this kind of pressure of expectation. And I have to confess, I didn't phone him up to say that I was missing his talk. So I watched it online with all the other talks, which is very helpful. So this is a very big topic. And I struggled a bit to work out how best to approach it. But what I would like to do is to start off by giving you, the participants, a short task. I'm sure everyone has a pen and a notepad. Maybe you could just jot down a few keywords that come to mind when you think of contextualizing the curriculum. That's the easy one. Just pop down what comes into your thoughts. And perhaps a little bit more difficult, what do you understand by the term decolonizing curriculum? So while you're noting those points down, you can, of course, put them in the chat if you want, but I probably won't have time to look at them right now. I just open up my PowerPoint. So I hope you can see that. So the task that I just gave you is written down here. And what I would like to do is to share with you an experience that I had last week. I have a research project through my position at the university, the National University in Taiwan, called The Art of Teaching, where Waldorf teachers present a main lesson to the group of teachers there, and they video that and send it to me, and often they send a presentation which they either do in English, or I use one of the artificial intelligence translations to translate it. And I'd just like to share a couple of thoughts that that we had last week. This is a colleague, Yi Rui, from the Cixin School in Taiwan, which is a very large school with 1,000 students, and it's over 30 years old, Waldorf school, and he's a high school history teacher, and his theme was the history main lesson in class 10 when he looked at ancient cultures. And he presented this, and I've just taken a couple of snapshots out of his major presentation. He basically developed the theme that we usually do in grade 10 in history lessons, going from, if you like, earliest human societies through the origins of farming and the first settlements, and then what is usually referred to as the first civilizations, and so on. He did that whole thing using illustrations from Chinese archaeology. What was particularly interesting was how he showed how the how Chinese Mandarin language has evolved and developed from an initial pictogram form to a much more abstract, stylized form. And he illustrated this with very fine pictures. Here one can see, I mean, I can't read it, I translated it, but you can guess what is here. This is a historical sequence of characters, if you like, from pictographic, the first one on the left-hand side is like a dancing figure, and then ultimately a much more abstract character, which really is a symbol for a complex set of ideas. And what happened at the end of the presentation was that the other teachers said, what does this have to do with Rudolf Steiner's indications on cultural epochs? Because he didn't mention Egypt, he didn't mention Greece, he didn't mention anything except China. In other words, he developed the whole theme of the class 10 main lesson on a Chinese kind of model. And we then went into that, which I won't go into today, but there is a major problem if you start applying Rudolf Steiner's idea of cultural epochs, if you apply it at all. But if you then ask the question, well, what about those cultures that he didn't mention or didn't mention within this framework? For example, the Chinese culture, or many different Chinese cultures over thousands of years. And we kind of concluded that what he actually did, I supplemented with, if you like, my idea about the rest of it. And we came to this feeling that, that we have to find an alternative approach. I don't know, where I can, sorry, I just have to go down. This first line is blocked out by the menu, but I can read it. So effectively, the main thing is that we have to redefine civilization. Because the idea, the word civilization and also the word culture, by the way, have quite different meanings in German, and as they do in English and possibly in other languages as well. And that there has been, over the last, let's say, 100 years, very interesting and complex discourse about the nature of culture and civilization, which we have to take into account. I personally find the definition by Felipe Armesto, who is a Portuguese English historian, he defines civilization as a society that manages to establish a long-term sustainable relationship to nature. That's what he defines as civilization. So most of the big civilizations that we're familiar with wouldn't qualify, because they usually exhausted their resources and had to resort to conquest of neighboring regions in order to maintain their empire. But we kind of looked at, if you like, there are archetypal steps in the development of human societies, from hunter-gatherers to early farming, to then first settlements, to the first theocratic centralized states, to what today is often referred to as the Golden Age of Barbarians. In other words, all those people who were not in theocratic centralized states, but who lived outside of those states, often very sustainably for long periods of time. Then the superstates, we're most familiar with the Roman Empire, the Han Empire in China, and so on. And then we move on to the global Middle Ages, which is a term more and more used in history today. And then we come to modernity, which then leads us very quickly to colonialism and the Age of Enlightenment. And we end up, if you like, in the next major cultural epoch, that of postmodern ideological empires like Russia, like China, like America. So there is a, if you like, just from the subject of history, there is a model that we can use that is, you can make comparisons to Steiner's concept of cultural epochs, but is actually much easier then to apply in an international context. Now, this colleague was able to do this whole thing. We only did in grade 10, so he didn't get as far as modernity, but you could do the whole thing on Chinese history. It would be wise, of course, if you didn't only do Chinese history, and that it's necessary to take what I call a globalectic perspective. That is one that doesn't privilege the local against the global, and it certainly doesn't privilege the colonial dominant European culture against any others. So if you're looking for a kind of a rule of thumb, is start local and then go global. And if you're dealing with history or literature, look for all forms of how cultures, or all the different ways in which cultures have influenced each other. Cultures are very, very rarely hermetically sealed. Sometimes they try to, but human nature being what it is, and the realities of trade and exchange, ideas are always flowing from one place to another, and no one culture is in any sense pure. So cultural interaction is actually the norm and should be a fairly major focus of our history. And what goes along with that is really the necessity to be critical and to interrogate essentialist concepts such as race or folk soul, which is translated from the German, even terms like people, the Chinese people, the Russian people, the American people. Who are they? They are not a homogeneous group of people. They're highly diverse. And we should also be critical when we speak of the spirit of a particular language. English, French, Russian. These are evolving linguistic phenomena which are not nearly as separate as dictionaries and linguistics often try to suggest. In fact, some countries try very hard to keep their language as pure as possible. Of course, it's like trying to keep the tide back. Unless your national language is Estonian or something, then not a lot of people are kind of adopting Estonian words. Although one of them, of course, has become part of our lives, and that is the word sky there. From the same book, which is in, as you can see, in Dutch, or Belgian Dutch, Flemish, the positions between the people in the picture are fairly clear. And if we had more time looking at the text on the picture at the bottom and so on, you can find out a lot of information. But the picture tells a story, obviously, as indeed does this one. So white, black, in, black, white. together, but yet separate. So it really is quite a remarkable photograph, no doubt staged, obviously, but it kind of says a lot about a colonial, European white colonial settler population, the white washing in the back line, and on the washing line in the background. Really, there's a lot that one could interpret in such a picture. As indeed with this one. We have no idea what the intention of the photographer was, but implicitly the intention of the photograph is not only to demonstrate that these probably pygmies from the Belgian Congo, but in a sense it symbolically says, here is this white man is the measure of all things. The pygmies are abnormal. They're not only different because they're black and naked, but they're abnormal in the sense that they are smaller than people should be. And so the whole kind of, I imagine that the subconscious expression of superiority and of everything that belongs to the sense of white civilization is summed up. And also the facial expressions of the two people speak more than we could put into words at this stage. So that's, if you like, that's a question of, that's colonization. That's what we mean when we say the subject is colonization, and to decolonize, or in a post-colonial way, we would want to understand the historical origins of European colonialism. We would want to understand the effects of colonialism on the people at the time. And we would above all want to understand the ongoing, continuing effects of 500 years of colonialism, European colonialism. And to look at the way in which the post-colonial world is still struggling with the consequences of all this and all the layers of complexity. The settler populations like the Afrikaner who go to South Africa at approximately the same time as the Xhosa and Zulu people migrated southward. So they all arrived as migrants in South Africa, and the local Khoisan population were kind of marginalized through that. And if you live in a country like South Africa for 500 years, you quite justifiably feel yourselves to be indigenous. And the whole concept of what is indigenous, who is indigenous? When we say indigenous ways of thinking, then we almost certainly are thinking of people in the Amazon rainforest and so on. But of course, there are indigenous English women. There are indigenous Swiss, probably more, who are from there. That's what the word means. It means that they're native to that place. They're natives. And yet we respond to the concept of indigenous in a particular historical way. So we have, on the one hand, the question of contextualizing, in other words, addressing our curriculum to the place we're in, whether we're in Hawaii or whether we're in Croatia or whether we're in Scotland. We are adapting to the geographical location, to the historical context, and so on. And it's often, in multicultural societies, which most of us live in, it's often very complex. That it's not homogeneous. It's not. It's fraught with tensions and power struggles and marginalizations. The whole question of decolonization, and whoops, I now have to go back into, sorry, I have to share my screen. The question of what we mean by colonialism is important to consider, because Walter Mignolo, who was quite a well-known writer on post-colonialism and decolonizing, describes it as a form of thinking which strives to de-link itself from the imposed dichotomies, to the binaries, to the opposites articulated in the West. And he takes a epistemological perspective of it. The knower and the known, the subject, the object, theory and practice. Those are very Western ways of looking at the world. And we have to sort of detach, not get rid of them, they're not bad, but we have to realize that this is not the only way of looking at the world. And to take a quotation, this time it's from the Open University, it's in 2 parts. I'll just read it out to you. A curriculum provides a way of identifying the knowledge we value. It structures the ways in which we are taught to think and talk about the world. As education has become increasingly global, communities have challenged the widespread assumption that the most valuable knowledge and the most valuable ways of teaching and learning come from a single European tradition. Decolonizing learning prompts us to consider everything we study from new perspectives. So it's not just dealing with the origins and effects of colonialism. It's about trying to develop other ways of experiencing the world than the dominant Eurocentric, rational approach that we are most familiar with. So it draws attention to how often the only worldview presented to learners is male, white, and European. This isn't simply about removing some content from the curriculum and replacing it with new content. It's about considering multiple perspectives, making space to think carefully about what we value. Decolonizing learning helps us to recognize, understand, and challenge the ways in which our world is shaped by colonialism. It prompts us to examine our professional practices. It's an approach that includes indigenous knowledge and ways of learning, enabling students to explore themselves and their values and to define success in their own terms. That comes from the website of the Open University in the UK, which was one of the first institutions to adopt, in higher education institutions, to adopt decolonizing values. So decolonizing, whether it's curriculum or it's the learning process, because I'm using the word curriculum to refer to not only what is taught, not only content, but how it is taught, methods, when, in which age group, for example, and by whom, and probably also where. Do we teach it in the classroom? Do we teach it outside of the classroom? Or do we teach it in blended learning model? So decolonizing involves a critical analysis of how colonial forms of knowledge, pedagogical strategies, and research methodologies have shaped what we know, what we recognize, and how we reward such knowledge accordingly. In other words, what knowledge do we consider more important? Do we consider art a form of knowing? And how much credence do we give to it? How much status and value do we give to it? So decolonizing involves an approach that acknowledges the effects of colonialism, racism, and epistemicide. In other words, the killing of knowledge systems, which is something which is a very important aspect of it, is to understand how particularly how rationalism, for all the wonderful things that it brought us, ideas of rights and freedom and so on, also at the same time marginalized other ways of knowing. And the pharmaceutical industry is a wonderful example of that. And it seeks to remove the influence of what can be easily labeled as superstition, or it can be labeled as holistic. Holistic is not always used positively. In medicine, holistic medicine is not always taken as seriously as, if you like, school medicine or mainstream medicine. So decolonizing also involves issues of identity, equality, and power. And these issues are not just an add-on or approached as a discursive problem to be analyzed and explained. And this is the author, Rowena Arshad. She says, for me, issues of equality, diversity, discrimination are phenomena that have impacted on people's everyday lives. So we're not just talking theory. This is not just highbrow stuff that post-colonial theorists refer to. This actually affects people in their lives. So decolonizing means exploring, obviously, in a Waldorf curriculum, the effects of European colonialism, including all the issues about settler nations like the United States, South Africa, Australia, and so on, up to the present. It also means building into our curriculum the origins and forms of racism and the power structures that racism bring with them. And we can't say we don't know about this, because there's been a flood of important literature in the last 10 years at least to help us to understand how racism as an ideology, as a theory, as a scientific theory even, how that emerged hand in hand, of course, with slavery, and slavery was the motor for the Industrial Revolution. So we can't say that this is just something that affects the United States. Slavery is something that many countries in Europe got rich on, even if they didn't actually have slaves themselves. So all forms of othering, all the questions of identity, which are so important, particularly to young people today, the question of appearance, what in America is usually referred to as race, you know, whether you're black, brown, and the culture you identify as, gender, social class and status. Are you a migrant? What language do you speak? What languages don't you speak? And all the asymmetries that come with that. And as we've already said, the other forms of knowledge, indigenous, artistic, mythic, biographical knowledge. In other words, decolonizing means engaging with all the issues connected to inclusion, diversity, and difference. So I'll just stop there for a moment while I quickly reorientate myself. Of course, one of the questions that I encounter a lot when I raise this question is people say to me, yeah, but we Waldorfs have never attempted to colonize anybody. Why do we have to decolonize? We weren't involved in slavery. We weren't involved in anything like that. And it's a misunderstanding. That's why I think it's necessary to sort of tease it out a bit so that people don't just react and say, well, anthroposophy, of course, is totally inclusive, and we are inclusive. I think the more important question is, how inclusive are we? Could we be more inclusive? And what would we need to do to enable everybody who's in our school to participate fully, or indeed to make our school accessible, not just in material terms, but in cultural terms to people from diverse backgrounds. So I think there's a lot of questions we can ask. It's not enough to say, oh, we are inclusive, we're Waldorf, therefore we're per se. We don't have anything to do with colonialism. There's more to it than that. So to sort of round up this bit, I would like to move now to I'd like to recommend you a tool that can help in this process of, on the one hand, contextualizing. I think that's not such a big issue, and Waldorf teachers all over the world are contextualizing and have been doing so for many years on the whole. But perhaps the more challenging question is to look at curriculum from a decolonizing perspective. So the main tool that I would like to share with you is one that I've presented on a number of other occasions, but just very briefly, the notion of looking at curriculum in 3 different dimensions and 3 different layers, which I have called, just let me share my screen, the macro layer, the meso, which I managed on the weekend to spell with an I and not an E, which only I noticed, but gave me a sort of jolt of inner humor, and a micro layer. I'm suggesting that what all of us, if we are Waldorf teachers, practitioners, what we have in common, what we have adopted, if you like, are the fundamentals of Waldorf education. And one of those fundamentals is the sequence of developmental themes that express the process of individuation from early childhood through to emergent adulthood. We know that not all children and young people are at exactly the same stage of development in the same age. It's just a basic fact. They're obviously not. But our curriculum maps out a pathway that we invite whole classes to follow, that in a sense presents them with a sequence of developmental challenges at key points of their life course. And by doing it together as a class, and I think it's important to think of, although we put the individual at the center of things in Waldorf, actually the basic pedagogical unit in a Waldorf school is the class. The class survives all the teachers who come and go, and in itself is a formative reality for the people involved, and it's a field of learning. So I call it a learning community. So this learning community follow this path which we offer them, and it has the benefit that they all encounter the same kind of tasks and the same challenges at around the same time, even if they're not necessarily at that stage in their own development. At the meso layer of curriculum, if you like, okay, macro is, I suggest, is general. We can all do it. It's proven itself over 100 years. There may be reasons for accelerating it a bit now that puberty starts much earlier than it used to, but generally the sequence remains useful to us. The meso layer, of course, has to do with the culture you're in, the place you're in, the social expectations that parents have, what the state requires. At the European Council meeting at the weekend, we've been hearing about what the state requires Waldorf schools in certain countries, that the children be able to do certain things by a certain class and by a certain age and so on. So that's also something we clearly have to take into account. And it's also something that we have to continuously revise. In the digital globalized age, we clearly have to establish a coherent media pedagogy, not sort of something bolted on like lesson 6 on a Thursday, but media pedagogy is something that permeates the whole of the curriculum from early years onwards, in ways that our new European media concept has shown. So we need to adapt to the developmental tasks that come from society, from the times we live in, and so on. And that will vary from place to place and time to time. The micro layer is what you and I do when we plan our lessons for tomorrow. We take the developmental tasks of the macro and the meso layer into account, and then we adapt it Waldorf education is essentially an adaptive pedagogy. It adapts itself to the needs of learning groups and individuals. We differentiate tasks. We ensure that each individual is able to step into or to move with us on the journey from theme to theme, regardless of their interests or abilities. So this enables us, I'll keep it like this so I can see what slides are coming. This enables us to focus on the developmental tasks. Now, I just reverse the order of this layer, and I'll start with, if you like, the micro layer, the person, the individual. We need, obviously, the primary thing that Waldorf teachers do is they learn to read the biographical intentions of their pupils. Maybe we see it not as intentions, maybe we see it more in terms of needs. What does this one need? What does that one need? But it has to do with what they bring with them. It's their biographical intentions. It's their biographical mythos, in the sense of what is the plot of their lives. And this I think is a really important aspect, what identities do people bring with them and what identities emerge? And there's a lot of critique of what is referred to as identity politics. The right wing, the conservatives want to move away from that because actually that's the very thing that they can't really get their heads around. We all have identities as men, as women, of people of a particular generation, of people with a particular cultural background. Some of us have very mixed identities because we maybe speak different languages, or our families have different languages and different cultures at home. We are an incredibly mixed bunch. And I need to take this element of identity into account. So you can see biographical intentions is the level of the self. What does the I, incarnating I, bring? And how does this I, or who does this I see herself as? How does she position herself? That, of course, will change over the life course. A 4-year-old, a 14-year-old will see themselves and position themselves in relation to others quite differently. And in doing so, they will bring their potential to expression. If you like, at the Meso Layer, leaving out all the other things that we have to learn, reading, writing, and arithmetic, we also need to develop cosmopolitan capacities, because we live in a cosmopolitan, multicultural world. It's no good just being a good Chinese person. You have to be a good Chinese person who knows enough that they can have narrative empathy with good or bad American people. The point is, we need not only to anchor ourselves in our own cultural location, and for many of us in a postmodern world, even that's quite difficult. Who am I? Which culture do I really belong to? Perhaps smaller nations have it easier to identify themselves as Czech or Slovenian or Croatian or Montenegrin or whatever. But if you come from a bigger country, German is kind of a bit of a generalized identity for people from Hamburg or Bavaria. So therefore, we need, at this meso level, we need to do what we can to enable cosmopolitan capacities, intercultural and plurilingual skills. Plurilingual means, it's different to multilingual. Plurilingual means that you value, respect the languages that children at school actually speak. So if you have one boy in the class who's from Sudan and his mother tongue is Sudanese, well, we're not really going to learn it, but we could ask him to sing us a song in Sudanese. We could ask him to tell us how to count to 20 in Sudanese. Maybe he can tell us how to say simple phrases. In other words, we show an interest in the languages that are lived by the people in the class. So we don't just privilege English as first foreign language, French or German or Spanish or Russian or whatever it is as second, and the rest of them we're not interested in. We are interested. We can't learn them all at this stage, but we'd be interested. And we need to have a globalectic canon of great art, great literature, and so on, great ideas. Yeah, start local, move to global. By the time you've done for example, the axial age maybe in class 10 or class 11. In other words, you've looked at this critical time in human history when many of the major philosophies and religions emerged. And to be able to present each one of those philosophies and religions with such conviction that the students think, yeah, I could imagine becoming Buddhist. Yeah, actually, there's a lot about Islam that makes sense, and so on. This ability to be able to have multi-perspective out of a certain high level of insight into these different languages. And the process, the bodily processes and the psychological processes that go along with the bodily processes, I call them psychosomatic, individuation, is a wonderful pedagogical tool that we're all actually doing it at different times, but in the same place. We're walking along the same road together. Yeah, and I would stop at that point. It probably is fairly obvious to you why I'm suggesting this as a tool for contextualizing and decolonizing. It's basically saying we have a model, a heuristic model of archetypal human development that anchors us all. Then we take, if you like, our cultural, local identity into account, honor it, value it. And if we really have a very multicultural class, then we should value all of them and not expect them to be, you know, young Ukrainian teenager in grade 9 who doesn't want to be here, who hurts, who's traumatized, who's sorry for herself, and she certainly doesn't want to have to learn German. English is bearable, but German, yeah, but she has no choice, she's here. So what kind of gesture can we offer there to be inclusive in that sense, in a plurilingual sense? And we're educational artists, or at least we're craftspeople with skilled artistry, constructing balanced lessons that are as inclusive as we can. So I stop there. I'm sure you have some questions. There's so much more that I could say, but I won't. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Martyn. I think we will have a vivid discussion, and there will be many questions around that topic. Who is going to start?
I see from some of the comments in the chat from earlier on that when I asked, how do you see this task of decolonizing, the telling the story from multiple perspectives is, I think, is a very important one that requires the teacher to have those, maybe not master them, but be fluent in some other perspectives, or find people who can do it authentically. And one of the things that we've learned from the work that we've been doing on coordinating policy for integrating Ukrainian students is that peer learning between students, peer support, is probably one of the best things that we can do to help migrant, refugee children and young people. Train, I mean, give some guidance to young people, and they can far more effectively take this multiple perspective by naively asking questions, to kind of get people to come out of their little snail houses.
So if there's no one going to put a question, or Ida?
Yeah, you go first, then I'll go.
Yeah, it's maybe a bit a general remark. What I'm thinking about is, you know, this aspect of decolonizing. It's spoken out from a person growing up in Europe, and we know Waldorf is a European thing, something which is deeply rooted in the European culture. And Steiner he was very much focused on the European culture in his anthroposophy and everything. So if this concept of decolonizing, if it is in itself a European way to put it, so my question would be into the to the others from other parts of the world, how does it sound in your ears? Is it the same way you would put it from your perspective, from your country, from your place? This is because it can be a blind spot, you know, that again, out of a European perspective, we speak about decolonizing, but maybe the perspective would be totally different from another country, from another perspective. And is Waldorf ready for that in general, for this step? Because there's, so to speak, a lot of admiration for European culture, a lot of admiration for anthroposophy and the roots of anthroposophy and everything, which is going together with, because Steiner himself, he was so much in love with German idealism and so on. So everything has this flavor, has this touch. And I asked myself, how can you do this? And what kind of multi-perspective approaches are necessary? So it's a bit of a general question. Maybe it goes too far, but maybe others are triggered to say something to that.
There are a few yellow hands.
Yes, Netu, would you like to start?
Yeah, hi. This is Neetu here from India. So what I've heard from Martyn, and so I'll just put it in the words that I have understood, and please correct me if I'm wrong. I'll give an example, like in the curriculum task, the book which lays out the Waldorf curriculum grade-wise. I was going through the grade 3 curriculum where we do the creation story. While in the bracket it is mentioned that one should choose a story which is relevant to their culture or where they come from. But I still see in India, everywhere they do the creation story, and they do the same creation story across, and very little weightage is given to the Indian version of the creation story. So what I heard from Martyn today, what I understand is that one can do the creation story that is mentioned in the UK Waldorf curriculum, but one also does the Indian version of it, and one can look at the other creation stories which are available from the other cultures also. Did I get that right?
You did. I would just put it the other way around. I would say you start with where you are. And if you want to take a Hindu creation myth, of which there are a number, there isn't just a single one, it's a pluralistic view in itself. My point would be, at some point, you might as well mention that all these Christians have a different notion of how the world was created. But yes, effectively. And I also have to say that this what used to be called the Yellow Book, you know, I wrote into the foreword that this should be, you know, after 5 years, this book has no validity. That was unfortunately, you know, over 15 years ago, and it's still on sale. Something I have no control over, but except I'm busy writing a new one at the moment, which has nothing in it that you could possibly follow. Yeah, but it's true. Yeah, the message is, you know, if you teach creation myths, then you do it for a reason. Not just because it's in the curriculum, you do it for some reason. So if a creation myth is the answer, what was the question? What was the developmental question? And if we look at it, turn things around that way, then you can start finding reasons. This is why I put this kind of developmental steps as a kind of given. I wouldn't say set in stone, but let's say, you know, something soft and malleable, but yeah. And then you go from there. But I see another hand up next. Is it?
Yes, Nisha.
Nisha, artist.
I'm trying to be. Thanks, Martyn, for the talk. I really liked the part where you had the 3 layers tool and how you then switched it to the other way around. So the self and the social, both included in the threefold. That was really helpful. I just wanted to speak to what Jost was asking about, how it's resonating with me. And I keep returning to the same thing, but I'm not sure what I can offer to people working in my industry, which is mental health. Because it seems like this, when people look at anthroposophy, they will initially think it's Christian, and they'll immediately put it into Eurocentric as a bucket. Now, I'm an Indian, so I was born as a Hindu, but having used the threefold process and the life processes, the 7 life processes, and worked to weave the 2 polarities together again and again and again, at some point, the Christ does come. And what has come for me as an Indian even is that it is universal. And that part, I'm not sure what to do with that. But yeah, that's what's going on. Like there's some feeling of it becoming about life processes, and that it's relevant for the time now through the human struggle of bridging the opposites. So it is biographical and it is heuristics, and I've done all that which comes up in your talk. And now I'm not sure what to do with that, because the word is Christ and I'm comfortable using it, and I'm actually calling myself Christian now, just this year. And I really understand the health-giving benefits of the Christian festivals now. But what do I do with that is the question. Yeah, because I don't see it as Eurocentric. It is universal from my lived experience of it. Yeah. So that's how it's sitting with me.
Do you want to answer to that, Martyn?
I think that's a very deep question. And if you like, this dimension that you're referring to, which of course is problematical to call Christian, but we understand what Steiner meant by it, or at least we try to, is this universal dimension, but everything else is not universal. And therefore we have to understand what it means. And we're all hybrids. We're all well, most of us, I imagine, are intersectional. In other words, we're between all these different things. We're lots of different things. And I think that's what makes it so, biography work, of course, so important and interesting. But I try to focus on curriculum and not on the big question of anthroposophy. On the question of anthroposophy, I kind of stumbled across a kind of formulation which works for me. I refer to, or I take into account, the anthroposophy that Rudolf Steiner referred to in his pedagogical works, which is a lot, yeah. But I don't, and I leave the rest out. So I call it sort of Steiner's Waldorf period. And it is, if you look at it from that perspective, it's very interesting to look how much of his earlier theosophical stuff appears in Waldorf, practically none. And that, I think that's quite helpful. Not for me as a Waldorf teacher, as an anthroposophist, that's a different matter. But as a Waldorf teacher, the only anthroposophy, in a sense, that interests me formally is the anthroposophy that he poured into Waldorf education in the foundation course and elsewhere. But I just personally find that helpful. Otherwise, we end up trying to kind of square the circle and defending things which really have got nothing to do with Waldorf education. I see Angela has a yellow hand up.
I've almost decided not to say it, but perhaps I ought to.
Will, you will.
I'm just about to take my hand down. Yeah, welcome. Thank you, Martyn. And yes, I live near Leicester, which is a very multicultural city, has many, many different peoples in it. And my daughter went to De Montfort University to do an MA in Fine Art, which is equally multi-cultural of all sorts. And she wanted to do a project on masks. And she was told that that was disrespecting the people who use masks, as she was using it as a, I don't know what, as a white person. So for a white person to use, well, your pictures at the beginning perhaps, is disrespectful. This is quite a common theme in these places. And nobody intended to be disrespectful, of course, but apparently this is how it is taken, and maybe we need to tread carefully about that. I just pointed out it's a bit sad, really, but there we go.
I think we do. I think you're right, Angela. We do have to tread carefully, because the bigger danger is from the counter culture, if you like, the sort of the anti-woke culture, which brings this argument, you know, that only a black person could translate the poem composed by a black woman. I mean, there's a question of identification that would be useful, but one can take it to extremes. Somebody in the chat asked if I have the right to the photographs that I showed in the beginning of my PowerPoint. No, I don't have the right. I found them in a secondhand bookshop in Brussels, and I didn't even buy the book. I just photographed them in the book, because it's a bit like, from my perspective, I've always felt that plagiarism is a very bad thing, except in a pedagogical context. It has a pedagogical purpose. And of course, pictures, one has to be careful about their rights, but I don't think anybody would be complaining about using these pictures for didactic purposes in a school lesson, for example. But yeah, no, I didn't even buy the book. I just flipped it open and made some photographs, because they seem to be entirely helpful for the questions that I had. Are there any more?
Ida, you wanted to say something in the beginning.
Yeah, I wanted, let me try to make an effort to express this. Thank you very much for your talk, Martyn. I appreciated Alwyn asking about the permission of the photographs in a way that is real in our school. And I think in many contexts where we are working with children and family who has, by the definition, who have been colonized. And I have two questions there. To date in your analysis, there is no struggle, there's no wound, there's no trauma. It's very much, let's just reshuffle it and make it locally sensitive on one level and global at another, and then adapt pedagogically wise at the third, not in that sequence, of course. And I think you have thought a lot, and we all think a lot about what is under that. And under that is voices that have been silenced, stories that have not been told, stories that have been overwritten. And there, the photos are very interesting. We all know the horror of the the Belgian Congo and Leopold of Belgium, and what a carnage that was. So I would want to know a lot more before I said that these are two people that are comfortably equal. I do not know that. And I do know that I can't assume that from what we see. And the next set of pictures certainly reinforces that there's a profound imbalance and some implicit violence. So I say this all to say, as we grapple with these important questions that we're discussing here, how pedagogically to think about the truth of the struggle and the truth of the trauma, the truth of the wounds. I think that's at the heart of Waldorf education, but I feel very much it's a task for us all to become more fluent in going to that level, because then we also get to the level why somebody might say you can't make that mask because that's offensive to this person. It is not because we just are meeting right now and everything is equal, but because there's centuries of violence that in the midst of beauty that we also want to equip our children, empower our children to meet and of course overcome and address. So that's a long question and I wish it were clearer, but I'm wondering if in some of the minutes we still have, we could think about that story under the story of just the pain of oppression, the pain of silenced voices, this pain of the story not told, and how can we honor that? Because that's of course our quest as a Waldorf educator. So I hope what if that resonates with you and others?
Well, of course, it's a struggle and it's all about pain, but you have to open a door to that. And it will be different if you were to show those pictures and tell the students what to think. You know, as if I asked you, describe what you see. Now, everybody knows that the Belgian Congo was, even in the 1930s, which is when these pictures were made, was horrendous. And the pictures, and there are a lot worse pictures, I didn't even show them here out of respect. These are the harmless ones because they're staged and set up and supposedly even humorous. Yeah, that's why they're shown in this way. But in a sense of kind of media pedagogy is to understand the power of images. And clearly, this, if you were showing this with students, they would need to know through literature and other things what's behind this. This is really to show how can a white community commission a high market art publisher to send a well-known photographer. Yeah, I mean, you have to put this into context. You have to contextualize it to peel out the layers of it. And I am tremendously open to, I never tell students what to think in that sense. They just need to kind of unravel the layers themselves. Just one very, very short example. A couple of years ago, I did a short story. I do a block in grade 11 called Post-Colonial Literature. I do it in English in Germany. And we read a famous short story by Chinua Achebe, which is about a progressive school teacher who'd been educated in the capital city who goes to a rural village with the aim of raising these rural peasants to kind of to the modern world. The story was written in 1972. And his wife wants to establish a school garden to teach these children modern methods of agriculture. And the villagers come and say, you can't do that there because that's the path that links the village to the graveyard. And the school teacher, who's, if you like, rationally westernized black, says that's just superstition and you can go around the edges. And so they build the garden, the school inspector comes, and in the night the people have trashed the entire school and the head teacher loses his job. It's a very famous story. And I asked the students, I had a very multicultural class 11 at the time, including several Syrian refugees. And they basically fell into two categories. The white Waldorf children completely sided with the villagers and said, of course, you cannot build a garden on the path of the incarnating souls. I forgot to mention that. It's the path of the incarnating souls into the village. You can't possibly do that. And the non-white students with migrant background all thought that the mission of the teacher was the morally superior one. I didn't comment on it. I just read their essays and corrected their English and learned a lot of humility by that. the fact that we provide them with a learning opportunity to engage with images like that or with texts in a suitable way, teach them techniques of doing it, I think is all we can actually do. But if we didn't do it, if we, you know, fill them full of traditional stuff that doesn't even take this into account. I'm the only person I've ever met who does post-colonial literature in English lessons in Waldorf school in Germany. And I preach this every year at the English week. Nobody, to my knowledge, has ever taken it up. It's blindingly obvious that that would be a topic that would be of interest and of immense value. But people are fixed in their traditional curriculum, which is why I tend to kind of, in talks like this, treat us all as grown-ups and kind of polarize a little bit, polemicize a little bit, because sometimes we need a kick up the backside, I think.
Thank you.
I have one question, which is a bit referring to what I said before, and I don't want to stress the point. It's just offering you the stage to say something to that if you want, Martyn. And I understand very well what you said about distinguishing between anthroposophy and Waldorf. I, as you might know, I do that very often too, and I don't have many friends around those ideas I publish. Because it seems to be some kind of a betrayal if you don't take the whole anthroposophy into Waldorf. Whatever, I don't want to go into this right now. A problem I often meet speaking about topics like that is that there is something inherent to anthroposophy and also to Waldorf education, very much inherent. This is the idea of higher development. So everything which is around Waldorf, there is a higher and better development. And of course, if you do pedagogy, you always have in mind a goal, something where you want to go with the children, where you have a better development, a higher development, and so on. But, you know, out of this thinking, Steiner himself very much was very European-centric, and he was very much expressed it that this is the highest form of cultural development you can imagine. And something like this, how can you deal with aspects like that, that there is higher development and there is less high development and so on? And it's very much a philosophical way how to deal it when you want to have equality, so to speak. So this is some kind of a philosophical and political opposition, equality and development. And developmental aspects are very highly part of every Waldorf work and pedagogical work. And I'm struggling with this. I don't have a ready answer for it.
I was in a room when your recent article in the Erziehungskunst, which basically said that, was read out, and people were very rude about it. So you can probably imagine. But I think there's different things that are operating here. One is the whole issue of can we take a critical position to Rudolf Steiner at all? You know, does the whole architecture of anthroposophy collapse if we take one piece out and say, you know, we don't want to make use of that, for example, folk souls, whatever it is? I tend to believe not. I tend to believe that the core anthroposophical idea is far more robust than that. There's that level. So there's a sort of you know, could Rudolf Steiner possibly have done anything wrong? Or misread the times, or how come he wasn't outraged by the massacre of the people in Namibia, which was extremely well published in 1906 and 1907. It was in all the newspapers, and his only references to it are, let's put it politely, not particularly sensitive to that. It's interesting that in 1910 there was an international conference in London against racism, and all the leading intellectuals of Germany were there, philosophers, Max Weber, a lot of other people, even Haeckel was there, that Steiner makes no reference to this. It's kind of was not on his agenda. So there is an issue there. The other thing I think is that that prevents us from, it gets in the way. We're so busy defending and fending off attacks from whichever direction that we're actually missing opportunities to develop Waldorf education in a constructive way. But that's on the question of, I think if you just drop the word higher and lower with all the kind of values that go with it, then clearly the paradigm of development, which is very, you can express it in terms of emergence. It's an emergent process. It's autopoietic, and there are all kinds of terms we can use. Even sociological concepts of socialization, individuation, establishing coherent and stable identities between the dynamic tension of inner and outer, and so on. Lots of different ways of talking about it without saying higher and lower. And one of the reasons I mentioned the Golden Age of Barbarians is a hidden agenda there. The Golden Age of Barbarians, the barbarians were significantly more civilized than the so-called high civilizations that fill our museums and so on. So even in historical terms, the concept of higher and lower gets in the way of understanding difference. And the fact that indigenous peoples, as far as we know, and if we try to understand them in their own words, have a different experience of the relationship between human beings, plants and animals and so on than people with scientific backgrounds. It's important that those two perspectives come into dialogue with each other, as indeed they do in some places. So I think it's a question not of the higher and lower development, but of the emergence of consciousness and so on. It's difference rather than a sliding scale, because nobody wants to be lower. I wouldn't like to be thought of as lower developed, or I probably am, but I don't like to think of it.
Yes, thank you. There's Nikolai. There has been a hand from your side. Is it still valid? You're muted. If you want to say something, you have to unmute.
Right. Good evening. Thank you for the lecture, Martyn, and thank you for your great articles that you have been writing. I have read quite a lot of from you. When I hear this lecture that you are giving, I am having an idea about that we are all sitting here, almost 100 people, listening to you and your great words, and everybody is looking out about approaches from the outside and in. And this is something that I often find in the Waldorf community, that it's so easy to look out. And if you are interested in anthroposophy, as I am, quite fairly, then you find that it's very difficult to address anthroposophical questions, because as you said before, as an example, can Steiner be wrong? And of course, Rudolf Steiner can be wrong. It's not even important if he is right or wrong, higher or lower or something. The essence, as I see, is the you know what I mean. Yeah, the approach of working, that we have this community, we have these schools, we are spreading in the world. And as I asked when I was in Oslo in the university there, I asked this Chinese lady who came to lecture, and was talking about the Waldorf community. And my question was, how do you actually, when you open schools and kindergartens in countries outside of Europe and America and South Africa or wherever, how do you make sure that they have a Waldorf knowledge and that they can act the curriculum? Because as I see, I'm from Denmark. If I hadn't known Nikolina from Croatia, I wouldn't have known about this lecture. And I wouldn't have known about Alanus, because the connection from Scandinavia is not obviously going to England. But because I know somebody from Balkan, then I have this opportunity to first time see you and listen to you. So I see that we should address from the inside and out, instead of so much from the outside and in, because we want to be Waldorf. We want to express Waldorf. We want to work Rudolf Steiner's thinkings, and it have been 100 years, and who is to renew it? If there is a thinking of, oh, what I read, I will keep to myself because I don't know how to address it in a way that can be not my opinion, but our opinion in a discussion. How do you see that we can work this lecture, as I hear that you can speak it in so many different ways, but if I take the anthroposophical approach, which I know that you are very much into yourself, how do you see we can work from inside and out instead of from so much out and in? Thank you.
I think we do work from the inside out, but we need to find a common language to speak to people who are equally interested in education, but don't come from an anthroposophical background. Nikolina, who you just referred to, last week gave a talk to a group of people in the European Commission working group on education, none of them Waldorf. And it was in Dubrovnik, so it was in Croatia, and she gave a talk. She gave a 20-minute talk, including a 5-minute circle activities with these ministry bureaucrats, and was able to touch them in a way that will make it much easier for Waldorf education in future in Croatia and in many other places as well. And I think that's the point, is that we have to get out of our little corner and all the sort of infighting that goes on there, and dialogue. People like Ida with her school in Oakland, in a community. I don't think it has anthroposophy written over the roof, but we know what's in. I love this expression, Waldorf inspired. I know in the United States, it's not a positive term, but who isn't Waldorf inspired? I mean, I am. So we're inspired to engage in dialogue with people who speak a different language, but have perhaps similar interests. But I think Nikolai wants to come back on that.
yeah, because this is actually one of the things that is pissing me off. That is Waldorf inspired, because of course you can say in the bigger picture that we are all Waldorf inspired. Of course we are. But I mean, what is it as a kindergarten teacher? You have this, you can have an ad. And if you cannot find an educated Waldorf kindergarten teacher, then you can always ask for the Waldorf kindergarten teacher who is Waldorf inspired. And that is maybe taking out that inner being that grown-ups should have when they're working with younger beings, because that is what they're getting, for an example. And I think that goes all the way through also in the school.
Well, I'm a great supporter of Waldorf teacher education. I think it's a good thing. But I also know, in my long career, I've been teaching for over 40 years, in my long career, some of the best teachers that I've worked with did not have a Waldorf training. It's not just about your knowledge of anthroposophy and so on. It's about your relationship to children and so on. And I think all these questions about how to preserve the purity, Waldorf is a heterogeneous, mixed process. It has a baseline, which is why I have my macro level. It has this baseline of, let's say, an anthroposophical pedagogy. And out of that, there are sort of ways of looking at the child, which then lead us to organizing teaching in such a way that it's healthy for them. But after that, it can take all kinds of forms. I mean, it really is not the outer form. And therefore, I'm always really, really cautious about, you know, declaring things to be, you know, official and true and recognized and certified and so on. A lot of people out there doing good stuff who don't know anything about Waldorf. And I would rather work with them sometimes than people who are quoting, although we don't find that so much today as we did in earlier times. It all depends on how anchored we are. If I feel anchored in anthroposophy, and I do sometimes feel anchored, sometimes I feel adrift, but often I feel like I have a kind of an anchor, then I feel supported by spiritual forces to engage with people and to find ways of making these things accessible. I think well, okay.
So
nothing to repeat myself. I'm sorry, apologize.
There has been a question by Shane into the chat to Nikolai, but as I understood, maybe Martyn covered already your question, Shane. Yeah, you write it in the chat. I think it's covered. Okay, but there is Will who wants to say something.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for the talk. It's been very interesting to hear, and your responses to the questions have also been very interesting. I'm a new, kind of just started on the teacher training recently, and have just purchased the yellow book, which I hear has gone out of date. So I'm kind of curious, when I'm reading this book, what should I draw from it, and how should I kind of interpret that information? If you see what I mean, because I think that's kind of relevant to this talk, is how do we interpret the information we're given? You know.
You mean this yellow book?
That's the one.
With my background, you can't see it. Yeah. I mean, to be very, very brief, I looked at this recently. I do occasionally read it and I think, wow, that was, you know, that the committee who wrote that were really kind of inspired at that moment. And some of them are actually here in this room. John Burnett, I can see down the bottom, and there are some others who were around. To be quite honest, the opening chapters and the so-called horizontal curriculum, I think, really stand the test of time. If you've bought the book, you might as well read it. And what it says about the, you know, the development of the subject, of the individual subjects, you'll just have to feel your way through it. I mean, not everything needs to be thrown out of the window. I mean, there are whole areas of the curriculum, like the math curriculum, which, as far as I can see, haven't been significantly improved on. Maths is still a difficult subject to teach, but so yeah, I mean, where it talks about the you know, how the horizontal curriculum, in other words, each class, because that's really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about my macro level, is what links the subjects in a given year, the topics, and all the other information that's in there at the beginning about assessment and governance and things like that. They're all very, I think it's all very good stuff. Yeah. So Yeah, I'm talking about the sort of fine tuning. What I'm not happy about is what one of the speakers earlier on said, is that this education, and just because this book happens to be easy to read because it's in English, and the equally good German one is not so accessible, people have used that because they think that's what Waldorf education is in places like India, where Waldorf education has been around long enough for people to know better. But on the other hand, of course, there are countries where they actually want to have a Middle European Waldorf, not even an English one. They want a Middle European one, but they can't read German, so they read it in English, because for them it's a kind of sign of quality. So there are Chinese high school teachers who absolutely insist on teaching the biography of Schiller and Goethe and the Nibelungen Saga and Parsifal and Faust, because if they didn't, then it wouldn't be Waldorf, the school. And all questions that direct them towards, traditional or contemporary Chinese literature, they're not interested, because that's not what they want. So it's just like, there are Chinese brands of automobile which are really good and half the price of a Mercedes, but people want a Mercedes.
Thank you.
A good closing remark. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for that talk and for the wonderful exchange we could have about it. I think it's not, at least we just started a conversation about a topic like that. It's not finished, and there are many steps to go in this direction. But I'm very happy about having the opportunity to talk about it here. And thank you for the nice comment from is it Trisha or Trisha? I don't know how to name it, from Nairobi, about your perspective in your country, what you gave us in the chat. And thank you for Laura for giving us all the text material from Martyn. So there's a lot of things to do around that, and maybe we should have a bit more time for a topic like that next time and go into it a bit deeper, and have some work around it.
Could I just say one word in
yes,
case anybody wanted to? The text there that you can see by the size of it, 650 kilobytes or whatever they are, building blocks for something, I can't read the rest of it, is very long. It's a chapter from a very big book that's coming. If you really want to read a kind of survey of what non-European post-colonial writers have been saying, that's something that you could look at. But the other ones are shorter and perhaps of more direct value. But I thought I'd put that in because it will be published as an academic book and nobody reads those, except Jost and myself occasionally.
Okay, so we finish here. I think next week it's me who is gonna talk, and it's about what consciousness provides Waldorf education. And while listening to you, Martyn, I was thinking, is it a very general perspective I have, which is maybe not can be specified? Or is it something I should be aware of? Maybe it's not so general as I think about. So I will take that into my preparation for my talk next week. Thank you so much to all of you, and have a good day, good night, good morning, wherever you are. There's someone from New Zealand in, I think it's already morning. So all the best for you. Bye-bye.